settle our differences, and that's got to be a lot more than nuclear. It's got to be, as Flint Leverett likes to say, a grand bargain. It's got to be everything from terrorism to human rights to the nuclear program to a recognition of the clear fact that Iran is really the hegemon in the Persian Gulf. Why do I say that? Because we recognized it for 26 years when the Shah was there. And Saudi Arabia is not going to like that, and the GCC is not going to like that. So it's going to take some exquisite diplomacy and a little arm bending by the United States to make sure that Iran gets the position that it deserves in the area, but at the same time, as our policy with China has been now for 20 years, convinces Iran, through whatever pressures we can employ, political, financial, economic, and otherwise, not military, to become a more responsible member of the region too, and to become a more democratic country in the sense that we understand democratic. Protection of human rights, tolerance, and so forth and so on. That's a hell of a long road to walk down, but I submit to you, it's a much more peaceful road, and a much more prospectively successful road if we walk down it without bombs, bullets, and bad. I see Netanyahu calling for elections in Israel and possibly winning them and getting a mandate, and I see an almost impossible situation for this president if Netanyahu and the Israelis decide they want to drag us into war. And I'm also extremely concerned about the fact that our president has continued to say no option is off the table. That phrase has become nauseous to me. No option is off the table. Oh, it's needed for diplomacy. Well, if you say no option is off the table and every other option fails, what choice do you have then? Back up and say I didn't mean it? You paint yourself into a corner. And in this case, you've got a legislature, a Congress that's handing you paint and helping you paint. And so this is a real possibility, but it's a possibility that must be capitalized on. We must be successful. Groups like Niac and others that I'm working with in Washington are helping this process along. And going with Niac and others involved in this in order to put out our message, a more positive message in my mind, a message of peace and not war, a message of peaceful coexistence at a minimum. And I think we have made an enormous progress in an area where I didn't think we would make it. I don't want to give too much optimism on it because I know how narrow the political space still is. But I do think we've made enormous progress given the opposition we confronted. That's essentially what our message has been. I think, as I said, we're being increasingly successful. I'd like to think even that Niac in particular has had some influence on the president's speech at APAC, for example, where he cautioned about this loose talk of war. I've served 3 presidents fairly closely. George Herbert Walker Bush, Bill Clinton, and then George W. Bush. It is so difficult for our presidents to escape the constraints that confine them. It is almost impossible unless you have an indomitable courage, an exhaustive knowledge. Think Dwight Eisenhower, think Franklin Roosevelt, think Abraham Lincoln. Boy, there aren't too many, are there? But if you're just Barack Obama, or just Dick Cheney, or just George W. Bush, you know, they put their pants and skirts on the same way you do. And by and large, they're mediocre people. That's the truth of our political system. It's also its strength. But they are confined so tightly by the constraints, both international and domestic, put around them, that you would just simply be amazed to listen to them have a deliberative conversation sometimes. Especially if one of them is your much revered boss. And you see how his rational counsel, his reasonable advice, his wide-ranging perspective, his desire for peace, the reluctant warrior they called him, not for nothing, is thwarted by not just the bureaucracy, but all the special interests that play on that bureaucracy from day in to day out. Special interests like I was talking about before. Why do the GCC countries need $60 billion worth of Lockheed Martin's missile defense. Because Iran might attack them. So why would we hype the Iranian threat? Lockheed Martin loves it. That's just a small microcosm of the influences and special interests that work on your government every day of the week. And I admire anybody who's got the courage and the political will and the political skill to get around that. And I think we need to trust this particular president right now in these negotiations until he fails, and pray that he doesn't, and push this as hard as we can in every way we know how to push it. And Niac does that as well as anybody inside the Beltway. And for that, I'm grateful.